I am recording this not as Count Dooku, not as Darth Tyrannus, but as something caught between those identities, a consciousness that has lived in both states and can no longer fully inhabit either. The Jedi would call this confession a fallen master's attempt at redemption. The Sith would call it weakness, the pathetic muling of a tool that has outlived its usefulness. I call it the truth, recorded here in the private archives of Sereno, where no one will find it until long after I am dead, until after Sidious has discarded me as he discards all his instruments, until the galaxy I tried to reshape has moved on to new catastrophes and my ideology has been reduced to a footnote in histories, written by victors who never understood what I was actually trying to accomplish. My name was Dooku of Sereno, Jedi Master, member of the High Council, teacher of Qui-Gon Jinn, and I believed in the Republic with the fervor that only the aristocratic born can muster when they convince themselves they serve something greater than their own privilege. I was 68 years old when I left the Order, walked away from the temple on Coruscant carrying nothing but my lightsaber and the growing conviction that the Jedi had become so entangled with a corrupt political system that they could no longer see the Republic was dying from the inside. Everyone remembers that I left. Few ask why I stayed as long as I did, what it cost to maintain faith in an institution that grew more compromised with each passing year, each Senate vote that favored corporate interests over populations, each mission where we enforced the will of politicians who viewed the Jedi as an armed extension of their bureaucratic power. I remember the exact moment I understood the Republic was irredeemable, the specific incident that crystallized decades of accumulated doubt into certainty. It was on Eriadu, a trade conference that was supposed to resolve tariff disputes, but was actually theater, political performance designed to create the illusion of democratic process, while the real decisions happened in private meetings between Trade Federation representatives and senators whose voting records perfectly aligned with their undisclosed financial interests. I was there as a Jedi observer, a role that increasingly meant standing in formal robes while corruption conducted itself openly in language designed to make theft sound like governance. A young senator from the Outer Rim territories, I don't remember his name, attempted to introduce legislation that would have limited the Trade Federation's ability to establish private security forces in disputed systems. He gave an impassioned speech about sovereignty, about the rights of populations to determine their own economic relationships without corporate military enforcement. The other senators listened with expressions of polite attention that barely concealed their contempt for his naivety, and when the vote happened, his legislation failed. Spectacularly, didn't even receive enough support to warrant detailed opposition. I approached the senator afterward in the corridors outside the conference chamber, thinking perhaps to offer some consolation or tactical advice for future attempts, and I found him sitting on a stone bench with his head in his hands, not crying but emanating the hollow despair of someone who has just discovered that the system he believed in was designed to prevent exactly the kind of change he was advocating for. He looked up at me, recognized the Jedi robes, and said something I've never forgotten. "You stand there watching us destroy ourselves, and you do nothing. You serve the Republic, but the Republic is already dead, and everyone knows it except you." I wanted to argue, wanted to explain that the Jedi worked for peace and justice within the existing structures, that we couldn't simply impose our will on democratic institutions. But the words died in my throat because I knew he was right, knew that our supposed neutrality was actually complicity, that by lending our legitimacy to a system this corrupt, we were helping to perpetuate it. I reported the incident to the council, thinking they would share my concern, my growing sense that we needed to fundamentally reassess our relationship with the Senate, but Master Yoda listened with that infuriating expression of patient wisdom he used when he'd already decided your perspective was incorrect and was simply waiting for you to finish speaking so he could explain why. He said that attachment to outcomes was the path of the dark side, that the Jedi served the Force, not political systems, and that if the Republic fell, it would be because the Force willed it, and our role was to maintain peace during the transition to whatever came next. It was the kind of circular reasoning the Council specialized in, using the Force as an explanatory mechanism for their own political quietism, and I left that meeting understanding that I would never convince them that the institution I'd given my life to was too invested in its own power and prestige to risk the kind of confrontation that might actually change the trajectory the galaxy was on. But I didn't leave yet, didn't walk away from the Order for another 13 years, and I think that delay, that extended period of knowing what I should do but lacking the courage to actually do it, that was when the real corruption began in my thinking. When you know something is wrong and continue participating anyway, you start building elaborate intellectual frameworks to justify your compliance. Start convincing yourself that you're actually serving some higher purpose that excuses the immediate compromises. I became the Jedi Master who questioned everything in private and defended the Order absolutely in public, who trained Padawans to think critically about the Republic while simultaneously teaching them to obey the Council without reservation, who performed my duties with increasing mechanical precision because the alternative was acknowledging that every mission accomplished, every conflict mediated, every Senate decree enforced was another act of collaboration with a system I intellectually rejected. Qui-Gon saw what was happening to me, confronted me about it during one of our increasingly rare meetings after he'd taken Obi-Wan as his apprentice. We were on Coruscant, walking in the temple gardens where surveillance was minimal and we could speak honestly, and he asked me directly, "Master, why do you stay? You don't believe in what we're doing anymore. I can feel it every time we speak. The idealism that made you a great teacher has become cynicism, and cynicism in a Jedi Master is poison." I told him that leaving would be abandoning the students who still needed guidance, the young Jedi who might actually reform the Order from within if they had teachers willing to encourage critical thought. He looked at me with an expression of profound sadness and said, "You're not staying for them. You're staying because you're afraid that if you leave, you'll have to admit your entire life has been in service to something false, and that fear is already changing you into someone I barely recognize." He was right, of course, and his perception made me hate him briefly, made me want to hurt him the way his honesty had hurt me. And I felt the dark side touch my thoughts for just a moment, felt the seductive pull of anger and pride, and the desire to prove him wrong by demonstrating my commitment to the Order regardless of personal cost. I pushed it away, meditated on my emotions until they subsided into the careful neutrality the Jedi prized, and told myself I'd successfully resisted temptation. But the dark side doesn't tempt through single moments of obvious choice. It tempts through accumulated small compromises, through the gradual erosion of the principles you thought were inviolate, through the gap between what you believe and what you're willing to do about those beliefs. I stayed in the Order for another 8 years after that conversation, and every year the gap widened, and every year my ability to feel the warning signs diminished because I'd normalized the dissonance between my stated values and my actual behavior. I left the Jedi Order 73 days after Qui-Gon's death on Naboo, after I'd stood in the council chambers and listened to them discuss my former Padawan's violation of protocol in training the boy Skywalker without authorization, after I'd watched them turn a moment of genuine tragedy, the first Sith engagement in 1,000 years, the death of one of our best knights, into a bureaucratic proceeding about proper procedure for Padawan selection. Something broke in me during that meeting, some final thread of faith that had been fraying for decades, and I understood that Qui-Gon's death meant nothing to them beyond its administrative implications, that they would learn nothing from it, change nothing about their calcified approach to the Force and the galaxy, and that I had wasted my entire life serving an institution that had confused its own preservation with the will of the Force itself. I walked out of the temple that day and didn't return. I went to Sereno, reclaimed my family title and estates, and for the first time in 68 years, allowed myself to feel the full weight of my accumulated doubts without the Jedi training that required me to immediately release all emotion into the Force. It felt like waking from a decades-long dream, like suddenly perceiving reality in its actual complexity, rather than through the oversimplified moral framework the Jedi imposed. The Republic was corrupt beyond reform. The Jedi were complicit in that corruption. The populations of the Outer Rim were being systematically exploited by corporate interests with the full support of Senate legislation, and no one with the power to change anything was willing to use that power because the system was designed to prevent exactly that kind of intervention. I spent 2 years developing what I thought was the solution, what I called the separatist ideology, but which was actually a comprehensive critique of centralized authority and an argument for regional autonomy, for systems being allowed to form their own governments and economic relationships without interference from Coruscant bureaucrats who had never visited the territories they were making policy for. I wrote extensively, published under my own name, began attracting attention from intellectuals and politicians in the Mid and Outer Rim who'd been waiting for someone with credibility to articulate what they'd been feeling for years. The movement grew faster than I'd anticipated, attracted support from unexpected quarters, including corporations that saw advantage in breaking free from Republic regulation, and that should have been my warning, should have made me recognize I was being used, but I convinced myself that tactical alliances with morally compromised actors were acceptable if they served the larger goal of Republic dissolution. Darth Sidious approached me on Sereno during a private meditation session in the estate's observatory, appeared without warning in a chamber I knew was secured against intrusion, and his first words were not an introduction or a threat, but a question. Count Dooku, do you actually believe the separatist movement will succeed through political means? Or have you already recognized that the Republic will never allow peaceful secession and you're simply building a foundation for inevitable war? I should have ignited my lightsaber immediately, should have recognized that anyone who could bypass my security and knew to frame the question in exactly those terms was dangerous beyond any threat I'd previously encountered, but instead I answered honestly, said that I knew war was coming and that the separatists needed to be prepared to fight for independence, because the Republic's commitment to democratic principles ended exactly where those principles threatened corporate profits or Senate power. He smiled, and it was the smile of someone who'd won a game before his opponent realized they were playing, and he said, "Then you already understand what the Jedi refuse to acknowledge, that peace maintained through strength is just oppression with better public relations, and real change requires the willingness to destroy systems that resist reform. I can help you build what you're trying to build. I can provide resources and strategic guidance that will turn your intellectual movement into actual political transformation. But you need to be willing to do what your Jedi training forbids. You need to be willing to use power without apology, to make choices that will be condemned by people too comfortable in their privilege to understand necessity, to become the villain in a story written by historians who will never acknowledge that you were right." I asked who he was, what his interest in the separatist movement was, and he told me his name was Darth Sidious, that he was a Sith Lord, and that he'd been orchestrating the Republic's decline for decades, carefully positioning pieces on a galactic board for a conflict that would destroy the Jedi and replace the Republic with something stronger, more efficient, more aligned with the actual distribution of power in the galaxy. Everything in my Jedi training screamed that I should reject this, should contact the Council immediately, should recognize this was exactly the kind of dark side manipulation I'd been taught to resist. But I didn't, because he was offering me something I desperately wanted, the ability to actually implement my ideology, to transform my intellectual critique into material change, to stop being the scholar who complained about injustice and become the revolutionary who corrected it. I asked what he wanted in return, what the cost of this alliance would be, and he said simply, "I want you to learn the dark side. Not to become evil, I know you still think in those binary Jedi categories, but to stop limiting yourself to half of the Force's capacity. The Jedi taught you to suppress anger and passion and ambition, to release all strong emotion because those feelings might cloud your judgment, but judgment clouded by emotion is still better than judgment paralyzed by artificial serenity. The dark side doesn't corrupt, it reveals. It shows you what you actually value beneath the ideology you've been taught to perform, and if you're honest about what you discover, you become more powerful and more effective than any Jedi could ever be." He trained me for 3 months in techniques the Jedi would have called forbidden, methods for channeling emotion into Force application, for using anger and fear and even hatred as fuel for abilities I'd been taught required calm detachment. The power was intoxicating immediately and obviously, superior to anything I'd achieved in decades of Jedi practice, and with each new ability, I felt the worldview that justified it settling into my consciousness like sediment in water, like a fundamental truth I'd always known but had been prevented from acknowledging. The Jedi were weak because they feared their own strength. The Republic was dying because no one with power was willing to use it decisively. Peace was impossible without the capacity for overwhelming force. These weren't Sith lies. They were observations that directly contradicted Jedi doctrine, but which my experience confirmed at every level. Sidious gave me the name Darth Tyrannus and explained that among the Sith, names represented ideological commitment, that Tyrannus meant tyrant in one of the ancient Sith languages, but that tyranny was only pejorative when you accepted the premise that populations should participate in their own governance, a premise that ignored the basic fact that most beings were too caught up in immediate concerns to make informed decisions about complex systemic issues. The name was supposed to represent my willingness to impose order where democratic processes had failed, to accept the necessity of authoritarian methods in service of genuinely progressive outcomes. I took the name not because I believed I was a tyrant, but because I thought I understood the paradox he was describing, that sometimes you needed to override democratic will to achieve democratic goals, that temporary autocracy could create conditions for eventual genuine self-determination. The Clone Wars began exactly as Sidious had predicted, precisely because the Republic responded to separatist secession with military force rather than political negotiation, proving my critique of their supposed democratic values and simultaneously demonstrating that I'd been manipulated into creating the crisis I'd used to justify my ideology. I led the separatist military with the genuine conviction that I was fighting for regional autonomy and against corporate centralization, even as I worked with the Trade Federation and the banking clan and every corporate entity I'd claimed to oppose, even as I ordered attacks on civilian infrastructure and authorized war crimes in the name of strategic necessity, even as I felt myself becoming exactly what the Jedi had warned against, and told myself it was temporary, that once we won I would establish systems that prevented the kind of authoritarian consolidation I was currently embodying. The contradiction didn't escape me, but I'd become skilled at compartmentalization, at holding incompatible beliefs simultaneously and using sophisticated reasoning to explain why the apparent hypocrisy was actually ideological consistency applied to complex circumstances. I was fighting corporations by using corporate resources. I was promoting democracy by temporarily suspending democratic processes. I was serving the Force by using the dark side to accomplish what the light side's artificial limitations made impossible. Every Jedi I killed in battle, I told myself, had chosen to defend a corrupt system and bore responsibility for their own death. Every civilian casualty I authorized, I classified as unfortunate but necessary, acceptable losses in a conflict that would ultimately reduce total suffering by dismantling the structures that created systematic oppression. But there were moments when the cognitive dissonance became unsustainable, when I would stand on the bridge of the invisible hand watching a planetary bombardment and feel not the righteous certainty of necessary violence, but the hollow recognition that I'd become a monster, using ideology as justification for monstrosity. I remember a conversation with General Grievous that cyborg abomination Sidious had installed as the public face of separatist military might, after we'd destroyed a Republic medical station that had been treating wounded clones and Jedi. Grievous was expressing satisfaction at the tactical victory, describing in his mechanical rasp exactly how many assets we'd eliminated, and I found myself asking him if he ever questioned whether the things we did were actually moving us toward the galaxy we claimed to be building. He looked at me with those reptilian eyes set in that duranium skull and said, "I don't build galaxies, Count. I destroy the enemies of the Separatist Alliance as I was designed to do. Philosophy is your concern. Strategy is mine. And if you're developing doubts about the strategic necessity of our actions, then you should discuss it with Lord Sidious, because I was told you both served the same vision." It was the dismissal of a tool addressing its master's uncertainty, and it made me recognize how Grievous saw me, not as the ideological leader of a revolutionary movement, but as another weapon in Sidious's arsenal, more sophisticated than him perhaps, but serving the same function, pointed at targets and activated when needed, and otherwise stored away until the next deployment. I started paying closer attention to Sidious's actual statements and objectives, started noticing the gaps between the separatist goals I publicly advocated for and the strategic outcomes he was actually engineering through our military campaigns. We weren't weakening the Republic. We were forcing it to consolidate power, to grant emergency authorities to the Chancellor, to militarize and centralize in exactly the ways I'd claimed to oppose. Every separatist victory pushed the Republic further toward autocracy, and every defeat did the same. And I began to suspect that Sidious wasn't trying to help the separatist movement succeed. He was using it as a pressure mechanism to transform the Republic into something else entirely, something that would emerge from the war stronger and more authoritarian than anything that had existed before. I confronted him about this on Coruscant, in one of his secure facilities deep in the industrial sectors, where he maintained his Sidious identity separate from whatever public role he inhabited during the day. I told him I was beginning to believe the separatist cause was theater, that he'd never intended for us to actually win independence for the Outer Rim, but was instead orchestrating both sides of a conflict designed to produce specific political conditions in the Republic. He listened with perfect calm, didn't deny anything, and when I finished, he said, "Darth Tyrannus, did you actually believe I would invest years of planning and enormous resources into helping you implement your naive vision of regional autonomy? You're a brilliant man who has somehow convinced yourself that good intentions excuse strategic incompetence. Your separatist ideology is beautiful in theory and impossible in practice because it assumes populations separated from centralized authority would govern themselves wisely, which ignores every historical example of regional power structures devolving into exactly the same corruption you claim to oppose, just with different administrators. I told him he'd lied to me, that I'd been promised the resources to build genuine political transformation, and instead I'd been used as an instrument to accomplish objectives I would never have supported if I'd understood them. He smiled that same predatory smile from our first meeting and said, "I promised you the ability to implement your ideology, and I've delivered exactly that. You've had complete freedom to pursue separatist goals as you understood them, and the fact that your pursuit of those goals has inadvertently served my larger purposes doesn't make my promise false. It just makes you a useful idiot," which is what idealists always become when they try to engage in actual politics rather than academic critique. The phrase "useful idiot" detonated something in my carefully constructed self-perception, shattered the narrative I'd been maintaining about my own agency and sophistication, and I ignited my lightsaber without consciously deciding to, driven by pure rage at the recognition of how thoroughly I'd been manipulated. Sidious didn't even move, just stood there radiating amusement, and he said, "There it is. The anger you've been telling yourself you were channeling for strategic purposes rather than indulging for its own sake. Strike me down if it will make you feel better about your choices, but understand that killing me won't undo anything you've done, won't resurrect the Jedi you've killed, or restore the systems you've destroyed, or transform the Separatist Alliance into something other than my tool. You've already done the work I needed you to do. You've already become what you've become. And whether I survive this conversation or not, you'll still have to live with the recognition that Count Dooku, Jedi Master, fell not because he was seduced by evil, but because he was too proud to admit when he was wrong. I deactivated my lightsaber, not because I forgave him or accepted his justification, but because I understood he was right about the fundamental point. Killing him wouldn't change what I'd already done, wouldn't restore the person I'd been before I accepted his training and his resources and his ideology disguised as my own perfected ideology. I asked what he wanted from me now, whether he still had use for his useful idiot or if I'd outlived my purpose, and he said the war was entering its final phase, that soon the Jedi would be destroyed, and the Republic would be transformed, and the Separatist Alliance would be absorbed into whatever emerged from the transformation, and that I could continue serving as I had been serving, or I could refuse, and be eliminated like any other obsolete asset. I chose to continue, not because I still believed in the Separatist cause or trusted Sidious's promises, but because I didn't know what else to do. Because abandoning the fight at that point would mean admitting that every death I'd caused and every principle I'd violated had been for nothing, and I couldn't sustain that level of self-recognition without completely fragmenting. So I kept leading military campaigns and making strategic decisions and performing the role of separatist leader, while knowing I was participating in theater, while watching myself become more vicious and more willing to authorize atrocities, because if nothing I did mattered anyway, then moral restraint was just sentimental weakness that limited tactical effectiveness. The dark side had fully consumed me by then, not through a single moment of dramatic corruption, but through the accumulated weight of compromises and rationalizations, through the gap between who I'd thought I was and who I'd actually become, growing so large that I couldn't cross back even if I wanted to. I would meditate sometimes on the question of whether I could return to the light, whether sufficient repentance and changed behavior could restore what I'd lost, but I knew the answer was no. Knew that the Jedi Master named Dooku had died years ago, and what remained was something wearing his memories like a suit, something that had the intellectual capacity to recognize its own corruption, but lacked the moral courage to do anything about that recognition. I killed Jedi without hesitation during the war's final years, faced former colleagues and students in battle, and cut them down with the same lightsaber I'd once used to defend the Republic. And I told myself they'd chosen their fate by remaining loyal to a failed system. But really, I killed them because their presence reminded me of what I'd abandoned, because their commitment to principles I'd rejected made my own choices look like what they actually were. Not sophisticated ideological evolution, but basic moral failure dressed up in philosophical language. I was especially vicious with the ones who tried to reason with me, who appealed to our shared history, or attempted to convince me it wasn't too late to return, because their compassion was unbearable, because it assumed there was still something redeemable inside me, and I knew better, knew that Darth Tyrannus had hollowed out Count Dooku and was operating his corpse through pure momentum. Sidious sent me after his new apprentice eventually, told me to test the boy Skywalker, to engage him in combat and assess his potential, and I understood what that meant. I was being evaluated for replacement, being measured against the next tool in line, and my survival depended on making myself useful enough to justify continued existence despite my obvious ideological unreliability. I fought Skywalker above Coruscant, aboard the Invisible Hand, while the ship was being torn apart by Republic cruisers, and I recognized immediately that he was stronger than me, more connected to the Force, more willing to fully embrace the rage that I still partially restrained out of lingering Jedi habit. I could have killed him when I had the chance, could have struck him down while he was disarmed and Kenobi was unconscious, but I hesitated because some fragment of my old self recognized what he was becoming and wanted to spare him that fate. The hesitation cost me everything. Skywalker recovered, overpowered me through sheer strength and anger, and I found myself kneeling with my hands bound and my lightsaber at my throat. And I looked up at Palpatine, because of course Sidious was Palpatine. Of course the Sith Lord I'd been serving was the Chancellor who'd been consolidating power throughout the war, and I waited for him to order my release, to acknowledge my service and protect his apprentice. Instead, he looked at me with complete indifference and told Skywalker to kill me, said do it in that raspy voice he used when he wanted to sound like an old man rather than the most dangerous being in the galaxy. And I understood in that final moment that I'd never mattered to him, that I'd been expendable from the first conversation, that every promise and every shared objective had been manipulation designed to extract maximum utility before discarding me like any other depleted resource. I wanted to say something profound in those final seconds, wanted to articulate some kind of recognition or warning or repentance, but all that came out was, "No, please," in a voice I barely recognized as my own, the pathetic begging of someone who'd told himself he was beyond fear of death and discovered too late that he was as desperate to survive as any frightened animal. Skywalker hesitated, conflicted between the Jedi training that said executing an unarmed prisoner was wrong and Palpatine's command, and I felt a moment of hope that maybe my old order's principles would save me even though I'd spent years destroying everything they represented. But Palpatine said it again, "Do it," with that subtle Force suggestion underneath the words, and Skywalker's lightsaber came down and severed my head from my body. And in the instant before my consciousness terminated, I felt not the anger or regret I'd expected, but relief, the simple, exhausted gratitude of finally being released from the burden of being Dooku, of maintaining the cognitive dissonance between my stated ideology and my actual behavior, of pretending I was serving some higher purpose, when really I was just serving my own pride and fear of irrelevance dressed up as revolutionary commitment. Except I didn't die, not completely, not in the way death is supposed to work, where consciousness terminates and whatever you were simply stops. Something in Palpatine's training, some technique he'd taught me for preserving consciousness through Force manipulation, kept a fragment of my awareness intact even after my body's destruction, trapped in a state between existence and non-existence where I could observe but not act, where I remained conscious of the galaxy but unable to interact with it. I watched Skywalker's fall, watched him become Vader, watched him destroy the Jedi Temple and betray everything Qui-Gon had tried to teach him about trusting the living force rather than institutional authority. I watched Palpatine transform the Republic into the Empire through the exact mechanisms I'd helped him create, watched him implement the centralized autocracy I'd claimed to oppose, and justify it with rhetoric about order and security that sounded uncomfortably similar to my own separatist speeches about the necessity of strong leadership during civilizational transition. I watched and I understood that I'd been complicit not just in the specific outcomes Sidious had engineered, but in the broader ideological framework that made those outcomes possible, that my sophisticated critique of Republic corruption had provided intellectual cover for something far worse, that my willingness to use authoritarian methods to achieve progressive goals had normalized exactly the kind of power consolidation that autocrats always use to justify their rule. Every argument I'd made about the Jedi's complicity with Republic corruption, every criticism of their political quietism, every accusation that they valued their own purity over actual effectiveness, all of it was true, and all of it had been weaponized by Palpatine to create conditions for something genuinely monstrous. The Jedi were destroyed within hours of my death, killed by the clone troopers they'd fought beside for years, victims of a contingency protocol buried in the clones' inhibitor chips that I'd known about and never warned anyone about, because Sidious had convinced me the Jedi Order needed to be eliminated for the galaxy to evolve past its dependence on Force-sensitive peacekeepers. I watched Yoda and Obi-Wan survive, watched them go into exile, watched the few remaining Jedi scatter across the Outer Rim, trying to hide from Inquisitors who hunted them with techniques I'd helped develop. I watched and felt not satisfaction at the destruction of an institution I'd rejected, but horror at the scale of what my choices had enabled, at how many deaths I bore partial responsibility for, at how thoroughly I'd been used. The worst part of this extended consciousness, this half-existence where awareness continues without the capacity to influence or change or even fully experience, is that I can't stop analyzing, can't stop trying to understand exactly where my reasoning failed, where the ideology I thought I was serving diverged from the ideology I actually implemented. I replay conversations with Qui-Gon, with Yoda, with Sidious, with every Jedi I killed and every separatist I led, and every innocent who died in the wars I helped orchestrate, and I search for the specific moment when I could have chosen differently, when I could have recognized I was being manipulated and walked away before the corruption became irreversible. But there wasn't a specific moment. That's what I've learned through years of this ghostly observation, this forced contemplation of my own failure. The fall wasn't an event, it was a process, a gradual erosion of the principles I thought were inviolate, through accumulated small compromises that each seemed individually justifiable. I didn't wake up one morning and decide to become a Sith Lord. I made 1,000 small decisions to tolerate injustice I couldn't immediately fix, to stay in institutions I didn't believe in, to accept resources from people whose objectives I didn't fully share, to use methods I knew were morally questionable because the alternatives seemed ineffective, and each decision made the next one easier until I couldn't remember where the path had started or recognize that I'd long ago passed the point of possible return. I watch Vader now, see him enforcing Palpatine's will across the galaxy, and I recognize the same pattern I enacted, the sophisticated being who tells himself that serving a monster is acceptable because it allows him to accomplish things he couldn't accomplish alone. the brilliant mind that uses its intelligence to rationalize rather than resist, the proud soul that would rather maintain its self-image as powerful and effective than admit it's been reduced to a tool. He thinks he's serving order, thinks he's preventing the chaos that would result if the Empire fell, thinks that crushing rebellion and hunting remaining Jedi is tragic necessity rather than evil, and I want to scream at him that this is exactly how it started for me. This is exactly the thought process that led to my head being separated from my body by someone using the same justifications I'd used. But I can't communicate, can only observe, can only exist in this state of permanent witnessing where I'm forced to see the consequences of my ideology without any ability to warn others or change trajectories or even properly die. Palpatine did this deliberately, I've realized, preserved my consciousness as a punishment or a trophy, or perhaps just because he could, because inflicting this kind of extended suffering on someone who'd failed him was the sort of casual cruelty that entertained him. I exist now as a warning no one can hear, as a confession recorded in Force echoes that only being sensitive enough and unfortunate enough to touch the specific locations where I experienced my greatest failures might briefly perceive. I watch the rebellion grow, watch new generations of idealists convinced they can defeat the Empire through commitment to justice and democratic principles, and I want to tell them that idealism without power is useless, that the Empire won't be defeated by being right, but by being stronger, that moral superiority means nothing if you're dead. But I also want to tell them that power without genuine moral foundation becomes indistinguishable from what it opposes, that you can't save democracy through autocratic methods without transforming into an autocrat, that every compromise you make for strategic necessity changes you until the person who thought they were serving justice has become another tool of oppression. Both things are true simultaneously, and reconciling them requires a wisdom I never developed, a capacity to hold contradiction without resolving it into premature certainty. I fell because I was too certain, too convinced that my analysis of the Republic's failures was complete and accurate, and that anyone who disagreed was either corrupt or naive. I fell because I valued my own intelligence over collective wisdom, because I thought being smart meant being right, and being right meant being justified in using any method to implement my rightness. I fell because when Sidious offered me power to accomplish my goals, I didn't ask carefully enough what goals his power would actually accomplish, because I assumed I was sophisticated enough to use a Sith Lord without being used in return, because my pride convinced me that I was fundamentally different from every other person who'd made that exact miscalculation throughout history. The ideology I thought I was serving, regional autonomy, resistance to corporate exploitation, dismantling of corrupt centralized power, all of it was genuine. All of it came from sincere observation of real injustice, and all of it was weaponized by someone who understood that the easiest people to manipulate are those who are convinced they're too intelligent to be manipulated. Sidious didn't need to make me evil, didn't need to convince me to pursue objectives I recognized as wrong. He just needed to offer me the resources to pursue objectives I recognized as right, and then shape the context so that pursuing those objectives led to outcomes that served his purposes rather than mine. I think about the young senator on Eriadu sometimes, the one who told me the Republic was already dead and I was pretending not to notice, and I wonder what happened to him during the Clone Wars, whether he survived to see the Empire, whether he recognized his prediction had been accurate but his assumption about Jedi complicity had been too simple because the Jedi weren't preserving the Republic's corruption. They were just too bound by their own principles to effectively resist it, and their destruction didn't lead to improvement but to something far worse. I wonder if he learned what I learned too late, that systems can be corrupt and irredeemable and still be better than what replaces them when they're destroyed without careful thought about what comes next. The fall from Jedi to Sith wasn't ideological in the way I told myself it wasn't the logical progression of someone brave enough to question dogma and pursue truth regardless of institutional disapproval. It was the journey of someone who couldn't tolerate the gap between what he believed should be true and what actually was true, and who chose to align himself with power that promised to reshape reality rather than continuing to live in the tension of incomplete agency. The dark side didn't offer me a better ideology. It offered me the illusion of effectiveness, the feeling of actually doing something rather than helplessly observing, and I traded my principles for that feeling without recognizing that effectiveness without proper direction is just destruction with planning. If I could manifest for a moment, could speak to one of these rebellion leaders or young Force sensitives who might someday rebuild the Jedi Order, I would tell them this: beware of anyone who offers you the power to implement your ideals without cost, who suggests that your moral vision justifies whatever methods prove necessary, who frames your principled restraint as weakness rather than wisdom. The dark side is seductive not because it offers evil, but because it offers efficiency, because it promises to cut through complexity and ambiguity and let you simply act according to your certainty about what's right. And that promise is a lie, because certainty is almost always premature, because the things you're most sure about are usually the things you've failed to examine carefully, because the confidence that you're on the right side of history is the same confidence every tyrant has felt while implementing atrocity. But I would also tell them that the Jedi failed too, that their refusal to engage with political power meant they couldn't effectively resist political corruption, that their commitment to serenity and detachment made them blind to suffering they could have prevented, that their institutional preservation instinct overwhelmed their actual commitment to justice. The answer isn't to choose between the Jedi's passive complicity and the Sith's active destruction. The answer is to develop the wisdom to use power responsibly, to maintain moral principles while remaining strategically effective, to resist the comfort of certainty without falling into paralytic doubt. I failed because I thought I had to choose, thought I had to either accept the Jedi's limitations or embrace the Sith's promises, and I didn't understand there was a third path that required more courage and wisdom than either absolute. The path of remaining in tension, of using power while questioning your right to use it, of pursuing justice while recognizing your understanding of justice might be incomplete, of acting decisively while maintaining enough humility to change course when you're proven wrong. Qui-Gon was trying to teach me that path, was trying to show me how to trust the living force while remaining engaged with political reality, but I was too proud to learn from someone I'd trained, too certain of my own analysis to admit my student might have developed insights I lacked. The Empire will fall eventually. I can sense it in the currents of the Force, can feel the momentum building toward some kind of resolution, though I can't perceive the specific form it will take. And when it falls, there will be another opportunity to build something better, another chance for beings who learned from these failures to create systems that actually serve justice rather than just performing it. But they'll only succeed if they understand what I didn't, that good intentions aren't enough, that sophisticated analysis isn't enough, that even genuine commitment to noble principles isn't enough, if you're willing to compromise those principles for strategic advantage or if you're too proud to admit when you're wrong. I was Count Dooku, Jedi Master, Separatist leader, Darth Tyrannus, and I believed I was serving justice when I was actually serving my own ego, believed I was fighting corruption when I was actually enabling tyranny, believed I was too intelligent to be manipulated when my intelligence was exactly what made me such an effective tool. I fell not because I was weak, but because I was strong. Not because I was stupid, but because I was smart. Not because I lacked principles, but because I valued implementing my principles over questioning whether my principles were actually what I thought they were. This is my confession, recorded in Force echoes that will persist long after the last person who remembers my name has died, preserved in the fabric of reality as a warning to anyone with the sensitivity to perceive it. Beware of your own certainty. Beware of anyone who offers you power without cost. Beware of the gap between your stated ideology and your actual behavior. And beware most of all of the voice inside you that says you're different, you're smarter. You can succeed where others failed because you understand the dangers they were too naive to recognize. That voice is the dark side, and it sounds exactly like your own thoughts. And the only way to resist it is to maintain enough humility to admit you might be wrong about the things you're most certain of. I failed, and the galaxy paid the price for my failure, and I exist now in permanent awareness of that failure without any ability to redeem it or even properly atone for it. This is the true dark side, not power or anger or even hatred, but the eternal recognition of how completely you betrayed everything you claimed to serve, how thoroughly you were used by forces you thought you were using, how many people suffered and died because you were too proud to admit you were wrong. Learn from my failure if you can perceive this warning, and if you can't, then at least I'll have company in this half-existence when your own choices lead you to the same recognition I achieved too late. The dark side promised me the power to change the galaxy, and it delivered exactly what it promised. I changed everything, just not in any of the ways I intended, and now I exist in the ruins of my own ideology, forced to witness its consequences forever, unable to die or change or do anything except observe and remember and understand exactly how and why I fell.